The sun of the 15th century had long set over the battlefields of England, where the noble houses of York and Lancaster once clashed in a bloody, generation-spanning feud known to history as the War of the Roses. Yet, in the heart of the 20th century, within the sprawling, misty valleys of England, history was preparing to repeat itself in the most unexpected of ways. The ancient stones of the countryside stood silent witness as the House of Dumbarton prepared to clash with the House of Clampett in what could only be described as the Second War of the Roses. The morning air was thick with fog and the scent of damp earth when Jethro adjusted his makeshift armor. It was an elaborate contraption of metal pots, leather straps, and an overwhelming amount of youthful pride. He stood beside his massive, albeit somewhat confused, steed, preparing to mount. From the doorway of the temporary Clampett estate, Ellie watched him with a mixture of amusement and deep concern. She called out, telling Jethro that he had better go talk to Granny before he went charging over to the next castle. Jethro, tightening his grip on his wooden lance, shook his head stubbornly. He explained that he was only riding over there to bring down a challenge so that they could formally commence fighting the War of the Roses. He complained that Granny wanted to sneak up on them, which clearly proved she did not understand the feudal system, because knights simply do not sneak. Ellie sighed, resting her hands on her hips, and told him that he had better sneak back anyway because Granny was going to find his 10 breeches if he was not careful. Jethro turned to her, his expression turning deeply serious as he asked if she wanted to get herself a handsome knight, get cropped up, and live happy ever after. Ellie smiled softly, admitting that of course she did. Jethro nodded triumphantly, declaring that they had to fight his way, the feudal way, with honor, bravery, and intelligence. Ellie could not help but laugh, wishing good luck to the brave and intelligent knight before calling out a cheerful giddy-up. Jethro mounted with a grand flourish, but his coordination failed him entirely. Ellie shouted that he was all backwards, but it was too late. Jethro yelled a loud yee-haw as his horse trotted forward, carrying the knight facing the wrong direction. At the neighboring estate, Colonel Dumbarton stood in his prized rose garden, admiring the delicate petals and the manicured hedges. His peaceful morning was abruptly shattered by the sound of heavy hooves and a rattling metallic clatter. Baldar, his loyal and exhausted butler, rushed down the stone steps, his face pale as he announced that the Black Knight who rode through the rose garden last year was back. The colonel gasped in disbelief, asking if the scoundrel was back and riding through his rose garden again. He turned toward the noise, shouting for the clumsy lout to stop riding through his roses. Jethro, still sitting backwards on his horse and struggling to steer, yelled back that he was no lout, but rather Sir Jethro from the next castle. The colonel stared in utter bewilderment, asking Baldar if the fellow was truly sitting on his horse backwards. Baldar nodded grimly, confirming it was a mark of contempt. Furious, the colonel ordered Jethro to be gone, calling him a rotter and threatening to set the dogs on him. Jethro shouted back that it was too late, because they were officially challenging him to the War of the Roses. He warned that they would be back with their rabble to pillage him, yelling giddy up as his horse turned around and trampled another row of flowers. Baldar cringed, reporting that the knight was riding back through those roses. The colonel shook his fist in the air, cursing the Black Knight and loudly accepting the challenge, declaring that this was war. Meanwhile, inside the grand estate, a bewildered gentleman was caught off guard. He asked if the caller wanted him, Mr. Dumbledore. A nearby assistant corrected him, stating that Mr. Drysdale was calling from London. The man picked up the receiver, identifying himself as baggage and asking if Mr. Drysdale was still at the hotel. On the other end of the line, in a bustling London hotel room, Mr. Drysdale smiled broadly into the telephone, calling him Mr. Clavet and announcing that he had some wonderful news. He explained that it would not be necessary for them to come to London to see the Queen. Mr. Clavet frowned, wondering how they were going to give her back the deed to Canada, since he had it with him. Mr. Drysdale chuckled, explaining that was the exciting part. He revealed that he had been using his influence and contacting all his connections. Before he could finish, a knock sounded at his door, and he called out for them to come in. He continued into the telephone, boasting that as a result of his superhuman efforts, Queen Elizabeth was coming to Clamford Castle to see them. Mr. Clavitt gasped, stammering that she did not have to do that. Mr. Drysdale assured him that she insisted, because after what had been done for her, she would not have it any other way. Mr. Clavitt smiled warmly, remarking that it sure was a mighty great honor for them. Mr. Drysdale agreed, adding that they should not spin it around due to security reasons, and promised he would be with her before offering a cheerful Fabricium to you. Back in the main parlor of the Dumbarton estate, Osgood paced the floor anxiously, pouring a glass of water while looking at his wife. Vanessa sighed, looking up from her book to declare that they simply must do something about her father. Osgood sat down with a heavy sigh, reminding her that she knew her daddy drank when she married him. Vanessa shook her head, noting that he was getting worse. She pointed out that while other people see pink elephants, her father sees black knights. Osgood reminded her that the Black Knight incident was a year ago, but Vanessa countered that he had seen him again, claiming the fellow rode up this morning and challenged him. Right on cue, Colonel Dumbarton burst into the parlor, waving his hands wildly and shouting for everyone to arm themselves and take cover because the War of the Roses could begin at any moment. He charged across the room, shouting at the top of his lungs. Osgood looked at Vanessa, pointing out that the War of the Roses was 500 years ago. Vanessa humored her father, telling him all right and gently suggesting she would hide his brandy. Out in the courtyard of the Clampett estate, Jethro was busily assembling a massive wooden structure. Jethro explained proudly to Ellie that many a castle had been captured with these catapults. Ellie looked at the giant contraption, skeptically asking how he was going to get it inside the wall. Jethro grinned, explaining that he was not going to get it inside, but rather it was going to get him inside. Ellie widened her eyes, clarifying that it was going to throw him like a slingshot. Jethro asked if she had never heard of Sir Lancelot sailing the walls, claiming that this very contraption was what sent him a-sailing. Ellie looked worried, asking if he was likely to get hurt. Jethro laughed it off, saying heck no, and explaining that was exactly why knights wore armor. He chuckled, remarking that he reckoned that was where they got the expression fly by a knight. Ellie crossed her arms, asking what he was going to do after he got inside. Jethro raised his wooden sword proudly, stating that he was going to lay about him with his trusty sword. He added that when he got the enemy all pillaged, he would open the gate to let her in, so she could pick herself out a knight and get troughed up. Ellie scoffed, mentioning Hank Forrest and declaring she did not want a knight if he was all pillaged, adding that she would just stun the good-looking ones. Jethro instructed her to sit in the chair and hold it down until they got there. Suddenly, the kitchen doors flew open and Granny stormed out, looking around furiously while shouting for Ellie and Jethro, demanding to know where everybody was and what in the blue blazes was going on. Jethro panicked, waving a quick goodbye as he pulled the release lever. Back at the Dumbarton estate, the colonel was peering through a telescope out the window, shouting that here was some excitement. He claimed that a fellow in Twickenham reported seeing a speckled-breasted chap. He ordered everyone to prepare to repel attackers because the Black Knight was coming. Osgood, looking utterly exhausted, asked if it was a male or a female chap. The colonel squinted at his notes, muttering that it did not say, before turning his fury on Osgood, calling him a bird-watching pop and shouting that this was war. He declared that England expects every man to do his duty and commanded them to man the battlements. Osgood turned to Vanessa, mentioning that he thought she said she hid the brandy. Vanessa insisted that she did put his brandy away. Osgood dryly remarked that then it was time to put the colonel away. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively, telling him to relax because she had a plan to send her father to Scotland to visit their cousin Sandra. Osgood groaned, reminding her that Sandra was coming here, and so was Emlyn. The colonel, ignoring them entirely, banged his fist on the table, muttering a loud drat and demanding to know where his brandy was, stating a man needs a drop before battle. Vanessa tried to soothe him, telling her daddy to sit down, but the colonel insisted that the Black Knight was coming. Osgood asked if he was coming on his white charger, but the colonel snapped back that no, he was coming on a black truck. Osgood repeated the words black truck in confusion. The colonel nodded vigorously, claiming the Blythe had captured a fair damsel and had her strapped to a ducking stool. Vanessa sighed, asking Osgood if he was coming to the solarium, and Osgood agreed. The colonel shouted after them that they would suffer, declaring that if he had them in India, he would spread them on an anthill, before muttering about a blasted hippie and wondering where they had hidden his brandy. Down in the courtyard, Jethro was strapped into his catapult seat while Ellie held the rope. Jethro told Ellie to just cut the rope and away he would go, reminding her not to finish any hand tonight. Ellie promised she would not, and said she would just sack him. Just then, the colonel stumbled out onto the balcony, muttering that the glibsqueak had buried his brandy somewhere. He stopped in his tracks when he spotted Jethro in the distance, wondering aloud how the knight could have seen him. Baldar rushed out behind him, holding a weapon and shouting that the general forgot his sword. The colonel took a quick sip from a flask he found in his pocket, coughing and remarking that it was what he called a brandy with authority, before locking eyes with the figure in the courtyard and gasping that it was the Black Knight. Jed Clampett walked out into the yard, surveying the odd gathering of neighbors holding rakes and pitchforks. He called for the rest of them to pay attention, noting they were catching herb spoils. He turned to Ellie, asking what was going on and who those fellows were. Granny stepped forward proudly, admitting they got a sorry lot of rabble, but she had called out the cowards. She explained she was hoping to come up with the dirty dozen, but all she could get was the filthy four. Jed shook his head, telling the fellows to get up and go back to their jobs. Granny protested, telling Jed to wait a minute because these were the Clampett Commandos, ready to lay down their lives for his honor, and they knew everybody was not coming back. Jed dryly replied that was because everybody was not going. Granny scoffed, asking if he was going to chicken out again, and if they were going to be forever known as the Beverly Hills Yellow Bellies. Jed explained patiently that the Queen was coming here to pick up the deed to Canada, so they had to finish the feud. At the Dumbarton residence, Vanessa and Osgood rushed to the garden after hearing a loud crash. Vanessa wondered aloud if the old boy had a fit or perhaps he just stumbled and fell. Osgood pointed at the sky, asking what in great heavens that was. The colonel, covered in leaves but holding his sword high, announced he was off to the tournament because the Black Knight and he were jousting. Osgood repeated the word jousting in disbelief. The colonel explained that the Black Knight flew over the wall to engage him, but the poor blighter forgot his sword, so they were meeting on the field of honor to settle the War of the Roses. Back at the Clampett estate, Jed was trying to calm Granny down, noting it was a nice tea but explaining he could not send Granny's guerrillas back to civilian life because she had them all worked up to a pitch. He remarked that these killers had a bloodlust in their eyes. Jethro came running over, yelling for Uncle Jed and Granny to get everybody together because they were going to have a joust. Granny looked at him, asking if he caught one and stating she got him something to eat, adding that if he did not eat it, he had to fight it. Jethro grinned, saying that if you fight it, you clean it and you cook it. He proudly announced to Granny that he was going to have a joust with the Green Knight. Granny shrugged, telling him to let the Green Knight clean it and cook it. Jethro insisted he had the War of the Roses to settle, and this would settle it. Jed stroked his chin, noting that jousting is fighting and the Green Knight is from the next castle. He asked how this all came about.